Chapter 19. The Guangdong Army's Underground Fortress. Fatty questioned my military common sense, doubting the presence of a tank in the facility. I suggested we look first, as any tanks would likely be inoperable after nearly 40 years without maintenance. The interior channels of the underground fortress were a maze, and to avoid getting lost, we stuck close to the walls while searching for an exit. The channels and the storage areas featured arc-shaped ceilings designed to prevent water seepage. By shining our flashlights upward, we could see emergency lights and rows of pipelines installed overhead. If we could only locate a generator, there might be a chance of illuminating the place. We didn't have to walk far before finding a detailed map of the fortress on the wall. It marked main passageways, communication trenches, storage areas, hidden troop alcoves, shower rooms, barracks, rest areas, grain storage, drainage pipes, a power station, and other auxiliary facilities. However, the critical elements such as artillery positions, ventilation holes, counterattack portals, observation holes, combat command centers, and secret parts were not indicated. Inside the hill, the fortress was divided into 3 levels. The complexity and magnitude of its structure revealed just how heavily the Guangdong Army had invested in this military base. I took the map from the wall. Having served as an engineer-soldier and participated in the construction of military facilities in the Kunlun Mountains, I was confident that we would find our way out with this map in hand. The sheer scale of this secret underground fortress exceeded my expectations, with a depth reaching 30 kilometers and a defense width of over 60 kilometers. The hills flanking Wildman Gully had been entirely hollowed out, forming 2 permanent defensive structures reliant on one another. There were 3 connecting tunnels cutting across Wildman Gully, linking the fortresses underneath both hills into a unified defense system. The underground tunnel we entered through the wall of the Jin Dynasty General's tomb was the lowest of these 3. The fortress was designed with a wider front and back and a narrower middle, with only 3 tunnels connecting the 2 sides. This strategic layout likely allowed the defenders to cut off access and secure one side if the other were breached by enemy forces. From our current location, the nearest exit wasn't far, but there was no telling if the Guangdong Army had sabotaged the fortress exits during their retreat. Otherwise, our only way back would be through the tomb. We could also consider trying to exit through an air vent. Recalling what happened on the hillside the previous night, where the horses were attacked by something from an underground cavern, it struck me. Could that have been an air vent for the fortress? If so, it would be too narrow to escape through. I shared the thought with Ingzi and Fatty, asking for their input on our next move. Fatty said, I wouldn't have even thought about it if you hadn't mentioned it. The creature that attacked our horses might have made this fortress its lair. We'd better find some weapons for defense in case we bump into it again. I agreed. It's better to be safe than sorry. If the exit is destroyed, we might have to climb out through the tomb's tunnel again, which means another direct confrontation with the Shad. The storage should have a section for weapons and equipment. Let's see if we can grab some useful gear, ideally a few Japanese Type 97 hand grenades, which have a long shelf life and pack quite a punch, perfect for dealing with the evil spirit body. The armory was stocked with Army standard coats, blankets, dry batteries, mess kits, gas masks, and more. The unique design of the fortress meant some of these items were still well preserved due to the dry air inside. I pocketed a few Japanese Type 38 Arasaka gas masks and finally found the armory on the right side of the warehouse. Racks of wooden boxes filled with rifles lined the area. There were no machine guns, just the Arasaka rifles that we colloquially referred to as 38 Big Cover, or simply the Type 38. Along the wall were a few 60mm mortars, but not a single mortar shell was to be found nearby. Fatty pried open a wooden box carrying rifles and grabbed one, pulling back the bolt with a crisp sound. Shining his flashlight into the breech, he remarked to me, "Old who? These guns are still usable. They're all brand new, never unsealed. All the mechanical parts are oiled, and there hasn't been a single bullet through them yet." Ingzi and I each took a rifle as well. I lifted the Arasaka Type 38, aimed it, and then returned it. This Japanese gun, with its 5-round capacity and bolt action, takes too long to reload, and the kickback is especially severe. I'm not used to it. Before I could respond to Ingzi's question about why I didn't favor the rifle, Fatty interjected, "Don't mind him. He's used to playing with semi-automatic weapons in the army too much, spoiling him. These outdated models won't catch his fancy. When we run into any evil spirit body later, let's just stand behind him and see how he does with his bare hands. While speaking, Fatty found an ammo box on the lower shelf, unwrapped the oilcloth covering the bullets, which glittered golden under the beam of the flashlight. Ever since he could walk, his father spoiled him with firearms. By middle school, he was already adept with them. Although he had never used the Type 38 Arisaka rifle before, it felt familiar to him. Seeing ammunition available, he skillfully loaded the rifle and, as a matter of habit, aimed at me. I quickly pushed the rifle barrel away. Hey, watch it with loaded guns. Don't aim aimlessly, especially not at your own comrades. Only traitors do that. My dislike for the Type 38 Arisaka rifle stemmed from its impracticality in close-quarters combat due to its excessive penetrating power. Within a 30-meter range, a bullet could pierce through 3 or 4 people, posing a high risk of friendly fire unless fixed with a bayonet for close melee. Furthermore, with many metallic structures inside the underground fortress, bullets could ricochet in unpredictable ways after hitting steel plates, potentially injuring our own people before hitting the enemy. Confidently patting his chest, Fatty reassured me. With our shooting skills, hitting unintended targets isn't a worry. You know I'm precise as they come. I can hit the bullseye every time. How could I possibly hit the steel plates by mistake? If you don't believe me, we could put an egg on your head and test it out. I cut off his bravado before it went too far. My head wasn't designed to serve as his target practice. It was meant for pondering life, not for balancing an egg for him to shoot at. I suggested we stop the nonsense and find other weapons to use, as I remained unconvinced about the effectiveness of the outdated rifles, which are prone to misfire due to their age. I recalled a gruesome accident back during the Vietnam front, where a laborer misappropriated an old German-made firearm confiscated from Vietnamese militiamen, and it accidentally discharged while climbing a mountain, fatally striking one of our deputy regiment commanders. We continued prying open boxes on the shelves, hoping to find some Type 97 hand grenades. Surprisingly, within a box marked with a plaster flag, we unearthed about a dozen submachine guns of an odd design. Some resembled the British Sten submachine gun with its magazine inserted horizontally on the left side of the gun. However, these guns had curved magazines and an added wooden stock. Ing Zi, curious about the submachine guns, asked me, what kind of guns are these? Why do they look so weird? Are they some crooked model? I checked the bolt and the magazine. These are likely the Japanese Type 100 submachine guns, issued to troops later in the war. They're relatively rare due to low production numbers, perhaps designed to counter the Soviet forces. They're much more practical than the Type 38, especially for close combat. Even if there's a malfunction, it would typically just result in a jam, not a misfire or blowback. Ditch the rifles. You and Fatty should arm yourselves with these for defense. Ing Zi, unfamiliar with submachine guns, awkwardly tried to handle one, while also holding 2 flashlights for us. Fatty found a box of submachine gun ammunition, and together we began loading the magazines. Humming a tune, I loaded the bullets into the magazine one by one, feeling quite content. Since leaving the army, I hadn't had the chance to handle a submachine gun, and the memory of using the Type 56 in the service made my palms itch in anticipation. Just as I was enjoying the moment, Ingzi suddenly tapped my shoulder and whispered, I think. I saw a child run behind you. A child? That seemed impossible. In this remote mountainous fortress, far from civilization, how could a child suddenly appear? We were all crouched on the floor loading the ammunition, and Ingzi, holding the flashlight opposite me, caught a glimpse of the child's figure dashing behind me. I turned around and shone my flashlight around, but the corridor behind me was pitch black and eerily silent. No sign of any child. I asked Ingzi, "What child are you talking about? You must be seeing things." Despite her bravery, Ingzi, a girl from the mountains and deeply rooted in traditional beliefs, was pale with fear. "I swear I'm not seeing things. There really was a child who ran past behind you. No footstep sounds, just a quick glimpse of a figure. Maybe it's a ghost?" Ingzi couldn't provide a clear description, mentioning only a fleeting shadow that seemed like a little girl, roughly 5 or 6 years old. The exact clothing or clear features were uncertain, but the direction the child ran was towards what was marked as an exit on the map. The passage was only 2 meters away, and in such silence, I couldn't have missed the sounds of a running child. If there was no sound, then perhaps it was a spectral figure. This isolated underground world had been untouched for decades, and who knew what might be lurking inside? Today's events had already been harrowing enough. Better safe than sorry, I thought. If we can't face it, we might as well avoid it. I suggested we take a longer detour around to the fortress exit, avoiding the corridor the child had run through. It was a cautious move to avoid any more unexpected encounters. Ingzi, who had a deep-seated fear of ghosts and deities, nodded in agreement with my suggestion. It's worth traversing an extra 10 miles than to risk encountering an evil spirit wall. Fatty, on the other hand, was skeptical. He confronted me, saying, You've changed. Since you've returned from the army, you're not as fearless as you once were. It's not like you to shy away. Why are you thinking of taking the long way just because Ingzi saw a child? If you're planning to take a detour, go ahead, both of you. As for me, I simply can't manage the extra distance. I will take the shortcut. Remember when we were Red Guards, traveling to the countryside? Were we ever afraid of anything but Chairman Mao? I had nothing to say in response. Fatty was right. The person I used to be would have considered the sky falling as merely a blanket to cover oneself. From the time I joined the military to the Sino-Vietnamese War, I witnessed the sacrifice of one comrade after another and the countless acts of bloodshed and death. To be honest, I had indeed become somewhat overcautious, always weighing every step before taking it. Perhaps, with the passage of time, I had lost some of my former courage and boldness. I explained to Fatty, we're not as young as we were back then. We were indeed fearless and ready to fight anyone during our Red Guard years, but those were just absurd times. Looking back now, it seems both pathetic and laughable. Fatty argued, but at least during that era, you fought, you charged ahead. I can't stand to see you like this, so hesitant and scared. Do you remember, on your 16th birthday, the long poem I wrote in the notebook I gave you? I barely remember the gift. The notebook probably ended up as toilet paper, considering Fatty gave me many over the years thanks to his mother's position in a logistics organization. I couldn't recall any specific poem. Noticing my lack of memory, Fatty offered to recite a few lines for me. Fatty, who had an excellent command of Mandarin and a resonant voice, recited the poem with the power of a professional broadcaster. His voice filled the room as he recited from memory. In the parks, we played at gorillas. In the classrooms, we read our books in unison. On Xinying Road, we destroyed the Four Olds. At Jinggangshan, we joined the Big Link Up. As I listened to Fatty's passionate rendition of the first lines, the memories came flooding back. It was a narrative poem titled Salute to the Warriors of the Third World War, widely popular among the Red Guards back in the day. We knew this poem intimately, having recited it countless times, reveling in its rhythm, its familiar phrases, and the grand dreams of our youth. I got so caught up in the emotion, tightening my fist and reciting along with Fatty. On that unforgettable night, our desire to fight coursed through every vein. Inspired by our forefathers' fervor, we, the descendants of soldiers, were destined to gallop through war's smoky trails. Our friendship formed during that ultimate fight to end all exploitation. Through trenches, we shared bread and licked the same salty knife. We hummed harmoniously under the same army blanket, word for word, line by line, learning the revolutionary thoughts, the great truths ever anew. Beneath the red banner, with hearts true to the party, longing to dedicate ourselves, we clenched our rifles tight, our fists held high, and took an iron pledge. We are willing to give our all for the cause of communism. Amidst roaring cannons, we stood shoulder to shoulder, breaking through the enemy's defenses. Our submachine guns spat avenging bullets at the exploiters. Do you remember? We once quenched our thirst from the water of Don River, strided through Ukraine's grasslands, scaled the Ural Plateau, and reignited the Red Star atop the Kremlin. We followed the tracks of communes, roamed through the streets of Paris, charged into every town and harbor of Europe, chanting the Internationale. With Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, we blocked the venomous bullets of the Christians, planted the red flag on the banks of the Suez Canal. The glow of Swiss lakes, the lights of Pisa, the sundown over Yemen, Cambodia's temples, the cherry blossoms of Mount Fuji, Havana's cooking smoke, Spanish wine, the clear springs of Black Africa. None could make us linger, for we held steel guns, heavy duties on our shoulders. Among countless sleepless days and nights, through many blood-soaked battles north and south, our unbeatable team pressed forward, closely following the red sun. Listen, the calls of brothers from the 5 continents, roaring like fierce waves of a flood. Look, the righteous flags of slaves across the seas, igniting a prairie fire from sparks. Ah, a world awash in red, with only a speck left at the White House. 3 red flares rise into the night, and you pat my shoulder, say, "Hey, comrade, remember?" The earnest hearts of the kids we met on the battlefield of China and America. The words from a member of the Politburo. Of friends around the world, reveling in the prospect of liberation. Of those elder Red Army soldiers from the Soviet, with hope shining in their eyes. Remember, it is the final struggle, the decisive battle for humanity's fate is today. The bugle calls us forward, red hearts in unison, like the swift wind. With one hand holding a green leaf, the other a poisoned arrow. That brass eagle emblem, which reigned for 2 centuries, is cast into the flames. With people's victorious cheers, Fatty's recital vividly evoked the revolutionary spirit and intense camaraderie of that era. As I recollected the old times, it was a poignant reminder that, in the past, no challenge seemed too great. Ingzi, growing impatient with our seemingly endless reminiscing, interrupted. "What are you two even talking about? You're all hyped up. Whatever it is, can it wait until we get out of here? It's getting late, and we need to get moving, whichever way we're going." Fatty, now determined and equipped with the Type 100 submachine gun and several magazines, gestured ahead confidently. "Comrades, victory lies ahead. Follow me." With Fatty leading the way, Ingzi in the middle, and myself at the rear, we formed a vertical line as we headed for the passage where Ingzi had seen the child. The path sloped gently upward. After about 100 meters, it turned into an ascending staircase, indicating we were entering the hillside of Wildman Gully. The passage became narrower and more humid, the air heavy, creating a suffocating atmosphere as if being buried alive. Suddenly, Fatty, who was in the lead, came to an abrupt halt. Unprepared, Ingzi bumped into his back and nearly fell backward down the steps, but I was right there to steady her. I asked Fatty what was wrong and why he stopped. Turning around, Fatty shouted, "Run back!" His voice had changed. It was clear he had seen something terrifying that drained away his previous bravado. As Fatty urged us to flee, the limited light from our flashlights only showed a large space several steps ahead. Uncertain of what he saw but trusting his judgment, I was ready to back away. Then, a chilling sensation pierced my back. Dozens of ice-cold needles, as if hit by a freezing current of electricity, made my body tremble uncontrollably. With a powerful leap forward, my sudden burst of strength sent Fatty and Ingzi tumbling ahead of me. The dark, narrow corridor gradually inclined upward as we all scrabbled up the stairs, rolling and stumbling into the void at the stairway's end. Struck by a mysterious electric shock, the current felt as if it reached all 3 of us, sending a chill deep into our bones. We clamped our jaws to stop our teeth from chattering, confused by what was happening. It didn't seem like a simple shock from an exposed wire. Such an encounter would typically cause numbness throughout the body, not the deep, bone-chilling cold we experienced. Fortunately, none of the loaded submachine guns went off in our panic. Lying on the floor with the flashlight still on, we could see why Fatty had wanted to flee. This massive chamber, partly natural and partly man-made, was draped in green moss, with the damp walls and ceiling covered in a countless number of immense bats. These bats, significantly larger than the typical species, clung to the walls with their wings folded, their white, sharp teeth exposed, making for a hair-raising sight. Their eerie faces featured large, pointed diamond-shaped ears and round heads with round noses. With well-developed forelimbs, including unusually long upper arms, forearms, and fingers, they had sharp teeth and claws. I encountered such large bats while serving as an engineer soldier in the Kunlun Mountains. Known scientifically as greater horseshoe bats or pig-faced bats, they are bloodthirsty and carnivorous, among the most vicious of bat species. They tend to dwell in underground caverns and pastoral areas and prey on cattle, sheep, and other livestock at night. Especially in the grasslands of Outer Mongolia, they were once considered a pest. However, they had become a rare sight over the past couple of decades. It was startling to find these presumed to be extinct bats nesting in an abandoned Guangdong Army underground fortress. Making use of the fortress's ventilation holes to enter and exit their lair, these creatures couldn't have found a more secure place to call home. Some of these formidable-looking pig-faced bats were already taking flight, swooping down towards us. I attempted to get up but slipped on the ground, which was slick with layers of bat guano mixed with remnants of small animals. The reek was overwhelming. This guano, also known as night soil, is a highly prized ingredient in traditional medicine, sought after for its rarity, where acquiring just a little is usually difficult. Yet here, surrounded by such abundance in this revolting context, the thought of night soil's value was utterly repulsive. Abandoning the idea of getting up from the filth-covered floor, I pulled the trigger of the Type 100 submachine gun, firing bursts at the incoming pig-faced bats. As soon as I started shooting, the others snapped out of their shock, and all three of us engaged in crossfire. The muzzle flashes and the strobe of bullets briefly lit up the entire cave amid the cacophony of gunfire, ejected shells, and clinking casings hitting the ground. Thousands of pig-faced bats were disturbed by the noise and light, frightening creatures of the dark. The bullets hit many that then fell to the ground. Others flew about like dark clouds, some sweeping over our heads, while others fled through ventilation holes above. Our submachine gun ammunition was spent rapidly, and there was no time to reload. The bats swooped past us, their sharp claws and fangs tearing our clothing into shreds. Thankfully, our thick clothes prevented deeper wounds, though some slashes did reach our skin. The fear I felt was stifling. I was terrified of injuring my eyes, so I kept them closed, using one hand to protect my face and the other wielding the submachine gun like a baton, swinging wildly. My legs kicked frantically to fend off the attacking pig-faced bats. After what felt like an eternity, the cave quieted down, indicating the bats had likely fled. I felt for the dropped flashlight and was about to check for injuries among us when suddenly all went dark. The largest pig-faced bat, perhaps the leader of the cave's inhabitants, swooped silently toward me from deep within the cave. With its wings wide open, it filled almost the entire space in front of me. With only my empty gun and flashlight, I was helpless to fend off the creature that was now inches away. I could see every detail of its pig-like face, the layers of wrinkled skin, stiff fur, and sharp teeth. Just as it was about to bite, a flurry of submachine gun fire came from beside me. It was Fatty, who had reloaded his magazine in the nick of time, shooting the large bat multiple times. It hit the ground, struggled for a moment, then lay still. Catching my breath, I scanned the area. A few wounded bats were still struggling, but no others remained hidden. I had several cuts from the bat's attack, blood streaming down, and both Ingzi and Fatty had suffered minor injuries. Quickly, Ingzi tore strips from her clothing to bandage my wounds. The wounds on my body throbbed painfully, sending me into a swear-laden tirade. Back in the day on the front line, bullets and shrapnel couldn't even graze me. And now, to have been scratched up like this by those flying beasts, it hurts like hell. Fatty, concerned, asked me, "Old who, why the hell did you push us further into the cave when I was telling you to run back?" I relayed the events as they happened, only admitting that I might have touched an exposed wire and received an electrical shock, concealing the true strangeness of the incident. My guess was as good as anyone's, and quite frankly unbelievable. Ingzi checked the back of my shirt, and with her flashlight, she gasped, "My goodness, who brother? What happened to you? It doesn't look like an electrical burn." Fatty too took a closer look and noted, "You got shocked? There's a small black handprint on your back, like that of a child's." Bewildered by the inexplicable event, I could only curse under my breath at the possibility of being manipulated by an unseen force. Fatty, meanwhile, spoke again, and as he shone his flashlight, it slipped from his grasp. "Oh, my mother. Old Hu, Ingzi in the armory, you might not have believed me, but just now, I also saw a child run by." Ingzi and I quickly swept our flashlights around, finding nothing but bat guano and bat carcasses. There was no child in sight. Fatty, however, was insistent, swearing up and down that he saw a child dash behind us. "I swear, it ran right from behind you, into the depths there. I saw it clearly. A little boy, probably 5 or 6 years old, wearing green, with a very pale face. He didn't look alive." Now, aside from myself, both of them had seen a child inside the fortress. Could it be possible that they both saw differing visions? Or was this underground facility harboring a sinister secret? After composing ourselves and arming our submachine guns with fresh magazines, Fatty pointed to a section of the cavern's wall. The little brat ran over there. With the butt of his gun, he scraped away the moss and bat droppings to reveal a rusty iron door painted in bright red forbidding entry. "Standing no admittance." "Standing no admittance," Fatty read aloud, then explained to us with a hint of mockery. "You know what this means, right? It's telling us not to enter standing up. If you want to get in, you have to be lying down. Probably means it's either a morgue or a crematorium." Hearing Fatty's interpretation, Ingzi added, "What? Lie down to enter? So it's used for storing the dead?" I've heard the older folks in the village talk about the Japanese setting up crematoriums. Those iron doors must lead to a furnace then. Tapping on the thick iron door with the knuckle of my finger, I assessed its solidity. "Fatty, stop pretending to know everything. These 4 characters probably mean no entry. And although I don't speak Japanese, this much I understand about military installations. See that large groove at the bottom of the door with a hex pattern inside? That's where a turning wheel should fit. To open this iron door, one would need to rotate that wheel. The holes at the bottom are for ventilation. They make it an airtight door. When closed, it would suck the air out of the room, creating a semi-vacuum. That's typical for storage of valuable items. Our military bases have similar setups. The wheel for the airtight door had been removed, and without proper tools, opening it was next to impossible. As for what might be inside, it could be anything from chemical and biological weapons. Such speculation was reasonable as these types of weapons are usually kept in sealed rooms to prevent accidental leaks. Japanese chemical and biological weaponry has an infamous reputation for its lethal potency, capable of causing death even after many years in a dormant state. However, I'm not particularly interested in what's behind that door. It's more pressing to consult the map and find an exit quickly. Fatty, driven by curiosity and excited by my mention of the potential for valuable items behind the door, couldn't resist tapping and kicking it, clearly itching to see what was inside. Both he and Ingzi murmured in frustration at the unknown treasures that might lay beyond their sight. Ignoring their antics, I referred to the map for exit points. According to the map's terrain depiction, there should be a small passage within the cave that connects to an exit at the top of the hill. My search came up empty, finding only a side of the cave blocked by large, collapsed rocks, just as the retreating Japanese forces had destroyed the fortress exits as I had anticipated. Struck not only by the realization that the exit was blocked, but also by our filthy appearance in the aftermath of the bad encounter, we decided to take action. Situated beneath the spot where we had camped on the slope of Wild Man Gully, the cave ceiling above us featured large ventilation holes. Not straight but curving as a defensive measure to prevent intruders from above. These were the same openings through which the bats came and went. Unfortunately, we had no way to ascend them, and even if we could, the passages were just slightly smaller than an adult's body. The clever Japanese must have constructed them deliberately small to thwart any attempts by enemies to enter the fortress from above. I called over Fatty and Ingzi, informing them that without an exit we were left with 2 options. Either find another way out or return to the tomb and face the evil spirit body with our submachine guns. We couldn't afford to wander aimlessly in the underground fortress, especially as we hadn't brought any food with us and hadn't found any provisions left by the Japanese soldiers. It was pretty clear. The fortress stretched deep for dozens of kilometers, and venturing from one exit to another would require substantial time. Thus, searching for other exits seemed pointless. If the Japanese had sealed that one, it stood to reason they would have done the same to the others. With a kick to a bat carcass, Ingzi jokingly suggested that they could serve as a food source if really necessary. Fatty vehemently refused the idea, finding it too repulsive, speculating that the meat was either rotten or sour. Instead, he proposed that the iron door could be the way out and worth trying to open. I reasoned that the possibility existed since the map didn't include this particular chamber. Only a passageway leading to an exit was marked. Opening the door might not be too difficult. I remembered seeing tools in the armory that we could use to find an appropriately sized hex wrench. Adding to the impetus for a return to the armory, Ingzi remarked on our need for a change of clothes after our messy ordeal. Only then did we realize just how dirty we had become. Our clothes, hair, faces, and hands all covered in bat guano, blood, and mud, reeking to high heaven. Heading back to the armory was a short trip, only a few hundred meters. There, we found several Guangdong Army uniforms and coats to change into, wiped the grime crudely from our faces, and each of us donned a steel helmet for protection. Ingzi, naturally attractive, looked even more striking in the military uniform. Fatty couldn't help but compliment her. "Hey, sister. You in that Japanese uniform. You're like a spitting image of Kawashima Yoshiko." Unaware of who Kawashima Yoshiko was, Ingzi mistook the comment for praise and was quite pleased until I informed her. "He's saying you look like a Japanese female spy." Ingzi's brows furrowed in displeasure at the comparison. Quickly backpedaling, Fatty said, I misspoke. I meant to say, seeing Ingzi in military gear and armed reminds me of Chairman Mao's poem. At dawn, the acting soldiers exercise. With valiant bearing, they shoulder 5-foot guns. The women of China have a steely will. They do not adore cosmetics, only warfare. I chuckled at Fatty's recent poetic turn, adding, "You're becoming quite the poet yourself, reciting verse after verse. Look at us in these outfits. We really do resemble the Japanese soldiers." It reminds me of a story from an old comrade of my father's. Back when he and my father were serving in Shandong with the 8th Route Army, at the end of the anti-Japanese war, they were directed by the party central committee to sail from the Jiaodong Peninsula to the northeast to claim the spoils of victory. My father, who gets seasick, couldn't go and later regretted that deeply because he heard the northeast was full of foreign treasures. My uncle told me when they got there, they found a ton of Japanese goods. When their unit set off, they wore rags so torn they looked no better than beggars. Later, they took over a Guangdong army warehouse from the old Russians, and the whole unit had a change of attire. Other than the flag that remained Chinese, everything from their clothes to their shoes and weapons was Japanese, identical to the Guangdong army's gear. The locals in the northeast would run away at their approach, thinking the Japanese had returned. I suppose we now share a similar sentiment to those earlier revolutionary ancestors with their foreign prizes. In this moment, dressed in the artifacts of the past, we found ourselves connected to history and those who had walked these paths before us, the sense of victory tinged with the complex legacy of the past. With newfound preparation and equipment, I located a suitable hex wrench amid the storage of gasoline barrels. All set now. Let's not waste any more time. Adorned in Guangdong Army uniforms and armed with Type 100 submachine guns, we retraced our path, myself bringing up the rear. This time, neither Fatty nor Ingzi mentioned seeing any mysterious children, although I couldn't help but entertain some doubts and fears in my mind. I pondered to myself. Fatty said the child ran behind that iron door. What could it mean? Was it trying to show us the way out? Could we be so fortunate? Or did it have other intentions? Well, I still have a bit of glutinous rice left. They say ghosts are afraid of glutinous rice, so if that spirit causes any trouble, I'll be sure to send it back in defeat. If not, it wouldn't showcase my capabilities. I mentally steeled myself while following behind Fatty and Ingzi, and, although my back still ached from the cuts I'd received, the pain seemed to lessen. Soon enough, we stood before the airtight door, once more. To take every precaution, we all donned steel helmets and gas masks. I chambered around in my submachine gun, and before attempting to open the door, I had Ingzi ready a handful of glutinous rice to scatter and instructed Fatty to aim his weapon at the door. Should anything unexpected emerge, we would fire without hesitation. I also told Fatty to maintain a continuous volley of shots, leaving no gap while reloading. After ensuring everyone was prepared, I slung the submachine gun over my shoulder and gripped the door's hex-pattern bolt with the wrench. The door hadn't been opened in decades, and the threads were rusted tight. Putting all my strength into it, the wrench nearly snapped before finally, with a creaking and groaning sound, the door's air channels hissed as they filled with air, and the heavy iron door began to open with a clanging and grinding noise. I quickly stepped back, aiming my submachine gun and flashlight at the doorway. However, all was silent inside. The flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness within. I signaled Ingzi, and she understood, flinging a handful of glutinous rice into the secret chamber. Nonetheless, there was not a stir inside the room. All external sounds vanished, leaving only the heavy breaths from within our masks. It seemed our worries had been unfounded, a case of fear playing tricks on the mind. Without any further incidents, we allowed our tension to relax a bit. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, Fatty took the lead into the chamber, with Ingzi and I following close behind, entering the room one after the other, ready to uncover the secrets held within. The secret chamber, about 40 square meters in area and entirely isolated, contained neither bacterial nor chemical weapons. Instead, it was filled with over a dozen large sarcophagi. These coffins were scattered haphazardly, some decayed with time, varying in size and craftsmanship. There were even an oversized stone coffin and two particularly luxurious ones made of golden nanmu wood, with fragments of pottery and porcelain strewn across the floor. Looking back at Fatty and Ingzi, their expressions told me they were just as baffled as I was. Fatty questioned, "Old who, what's all this? It looks more like a museum with all these coffins." After a moment of thought, the answer wasn't that hard to guess. Wildman Gully had always been a burial site dating back to the Jin and Liao dynasties. When constructing this underground fortress and the 3 connecting tunnels that ran under the valley, the Japanese must have unearthed numerous ancient tombs. To them, the relics and the coffins of ancient nobility were treasures, so they stored everything they dug up in this semi-vacuum chamber. In their hasty retreat, the Guangdong army probably only had time to grab the portable antiques, leaving these coffins behind. Fatty was eager to find any valuables that might have been overlooked. Kicking open the lid of a sarcophagus, which had already been pried open by the Japanese and not renailed, the lid flipped aside. Ingzi preferred to wait by the door, anxious about the possibility of being trapped inside. I called out to Ingzi, impressed by her prudence. "Smart thinking, sister. I didn't even consider that. After all these years as a soldier, I could have easily overlooked such an obvious risk. If we all got stuck in here, we'd probably never find our way out." Fatty, meanwhile, was rummaging through the coffins, cursing as he found nothing but bones. Frustrated after inspecting 3 or 4 coffins with no significant finds, he turned his attention to a coffin with golden nanmu wood and red lacquer. My focus, however, was drawn to the immense stone coffin. An intuition told me there was something significant within. I felt compelled to open it, so I called Fatty to help me push aside its heavy stone lid. Despite our combined efforts, we only managed to budget enough to create a small gap. Panting, Fatty gestured to take a break. "No good. Need a rest. Too heavy. I can't push without something to eat." It seemed the task at hand was more formidable than we'd anticipated. Resting on the floor and peeling off our gas masks, we each lit a cigarette, trying to quell our hunger and gather some strength. Fatty exhaled a smoke ring, pondering aloud about the ancient practice of using stone coffins. I explained to him the distinction between a coffin and a sarcophagus, speculating that someone of high status, possibly a prince or lord, would merit such an elaborate burial. Fatty scratched his head, curious about the status of the person who would be buried in such an ornate sarcophagus compared to the general's tomb we had previously discovered. Historically, the nomadic empires of the north were formidable during the Jin, Liao, and Yuan dynasties. High military achievements were esteemed. Hence the possibility that this site contained the remains of prestigious warlords or nobles with richer burial gifts than the general's tomb we uncovered. Considering the contents of the general's tomb we had explored, the primary occupant seemed to be more of a warrior with no grand tastes for the sophisticated or artistic, reflected in the items entombed with him, mainly horses and weaponry. Fatty lamented that the excellent horses buried long ago would have been valuable if still alive, but now only the bones remained. He expressed relief, however, that at least the jade by discs were salvageable. With those, we might secure a substantial amount, possibly thousands, once we returned and consulted with a dealer like Gold Tooth. After finishing our cigarettes, we donned our masks again and, with Ing Zi's help this time, put forth another concerted effort to displace the large stone lid. Finally, we succeeded in moving the lid aside to unveil a sleek black coffin within the sarcophagus. This coffin was about twice the size of an ordinary one and unusually tall, half the height of a person even without the arc-shaped lid. The craftsmanship of the coffin was exquisite, clearly not ordinary. It was adorned with gilt paint and colorful details depicting auspicious mythological creatures, such as cranes and cheilants, to safeguard the owner's journey to immortality. The lid showcased a star map of the 28 constellations, and the base was wrapped in a band of clouds, all in gold, whose colors remained vibrant even after centuries. For all of us, it was the first encounter with such a magnificent burial artifact. Without witnessing it firsthand, it was hard to imagine such a lavish coffin existed, akin to a breathtaking piece of art. Fatty couldn't suppress his excitement at the sight of the exquisite coffin, imagining the hefty profit even without notable contents within. Even if there's nothing inside, we could make a fortune just by selling this coffin, he said, rolling up his sleeves to push the coffin's lid open. Together, the three of us peered into the coffin's depths illuminated by our flashlights. The brocade silk that once lined the interior had rotted away to the brink of disintegration, likely to crumble into ash at the slightest touch. Amidst the decaying fabric laid a skeletal frame, the flesh and clothes long decomposed over the millennium, leaving only a comparatively intact skull grinning with blackened, rotten teeth. The skeleton was so deteriorate that without the skull, it was almost unrecognizable as human remains. Ing Zi's flashlight beam swept to the edge of the massive coffin, causing her to let out a cry of surprise. "Oh my goodness! Look at this, the children!" At each end of the coffin stood the naked figures of a boy and a girl, both appearing around 5 or 6 years of age, sculpted with lifelike detail. The boy had a topknot, while the girl's hair was styled into 2 buns, their hairstyles reflecting those of ancient figures rather than recent times. Could these figures be ceremonial statues, child attendants meant to accompany the tomb's occupant in death? While the main occupant had nearly decomposed, these child figures were strangely well preserved. "These little brats must be fakes, crafted to look incredibly real," Fatty quipped, reaching out to touch one of the figures in the coffin. "Today, let's see if they've been enchanted or something." I quickly grabbed Fatty's hand. "Don't touch them without gloves. They're not fakes. They could be toxic. Look closely at the surface of these children. They're covered with patches of dark purple spots. That's mercurial eruption." In the 1950s, my grandfather, Hu Guohua, was hospitalized for an extended period in a large hospital in Beijing. During his stay, the construction of the Workers' Stadium began nearby, and workers unearthed an ancient tomb. Seizing an opportunity, my grandfather sneaked a visit to the site and ventured into the underground palace. Allegedly, the tomb dated back to the Ming dynasty and was said to belong to a prince. A circle of black water surrounded it, and the burial chamber itself was divided into 3 sections: front, middle, and back. A heavy gate secured the entrance. Once inside, the first chamber, known as the Ming Hall, akin to a dark hall, was outfitted with various furnishings mirroring the prince's household arrangement and filled with Ming Qi. The Ming Qi is the term grave robbers use for burial artifacts. The central chamber, referred to as the sleeping hall, was where the coffins, chained in midair, were placed. It was an unusual double burial with both the prince and princess's coffins suspended by robust iron chains, copper rings, and locks. The path continued to an auxiliary hall, designated for the placement of additional grave goods. In the same period in Haitian, workers discovered a Yuan dynasty tomb, which also contained sacrificial children, astonishingly well preserved upon excavation, although their garments disintegrated upon contact. My grandfather later recounted these tales as if they were folklore. He described how the children destined for sacrifice were administered mercury both through ingestion and by having it poured into cavities drilled into their skulls, backs, and feet. Post-mortem, their bodies were coated in mercury powder, creating a preservation effect like that seen in taxidermy, protecting the remains from decay over thousands of years. This method was far more sophisticated than the mummification techniques of ancient Egypt and represented the vast technological and cultural divergences between the two civilizations. Surely, one of the world's most barbaric practices must be the use of living people for sacrifice and burials. Fatty, wearing gloves, gently lifted the body of one of the children from the sarcophagus for a closer examination. Sure enough, upon inspection, he discovered several holes at the top of the head, the back, and the soles of the feet. These holes in the corpses had been skillfully sealed by craftsmen using lacquer. Several areas on the bodies showed patches of dark purple discoloration, known as mercury spots or mercury permeation. The people buried as sacrifices, as well as the accompanying gold, silver, and jade artifacts, were often coated with powdered mercury. Over time, chemical changes would occur, causing recently produced artifacts to turn reddish-brown and older ones to become blackish-purple. In some regions, these discolored spots are colloquially referred to as rotted silver or mercury green. Fatty was noticeably unnerved by the discovery, but he tried to remain calm. He exhaled and said, "I've read about mercury permeation in antiques in Lu Xun's stories before. It turns out he wasn't making it all up. These things really did happen." Ingzi, troubled by the fate of the children, asked, "How come these children weren't buried with clothes? The child we saw running earlier was dressed, wasn't it? Could it have been a ghost?" I responded, "Whether they are ghosts, only they would know. But it's not that these children were buried without clothes. The sacrificial boys and girls would have been dressed in their best attire. With nearly 1,000 years past, those clothes are long gone. They would have disintegrated the moment they were exposed to air, especially since this large sarcophagus likely dates back to the Yuan dynasty. When the Guangdong army discovered and opened this coffin, the garments would have turned to dust upon contact with the air. While I had never believed in ghosts, certain hard facts made it difficult to maintain skepticism. The resemblance between the children Fatty and Ingzi claimed to have seen in the corridors to the ones in the coffin, and the mysterious handprint on my back, suggested events beyond human understanding. Perhaps they could be explained by intuition or premonitions, but overall, these occurrences verged on the supernatural, offering us only fleeting glimpses into an unknown and mysterious world. Ingzi wondered if the children's spirits led us here with some purpose in mind, but sensed no malice in their actions. Maybe they just want us to bury their bodies. It's often said that burial provides peace, doesn't it? Let's help them. They deserve our pity." Fatty nodded in agreement. "I'm only interested in wealth, not in meddling with such matters. But this is an exceptional situation. Let's do a good deed and give them a proper burial. They've served their duty to the tomb's master for 1,000 years. It's time for them to rest." Since their bodies were filled with mercury and couldn't be disposed of by fire, the only thing left for us to do was to bury them, hoping such tragedies would be less common in the world. Without further delay, Fatty and I took off our Guangdong army coats, wrapping the boy and the girl, respectively. The leaden weight of the mercury-filled bodies made them incredibly heavy. Thankfully, they were children. If they had been adults, carrying them would have been nearly impossible. Fatty, frustrated at not finding any valuable treasure, half wished to burn all the coffins. However, Ingzi and I quickly dissuaded him, and he reluctantly abandoned the idea. Back in the stone cavern, famished and parched, we deliberated our escape. The underground fortress offered no provisions, no explosives, no water. The only path to the surface was through the tomb's original entry, a daunting prospect given the evil spirit body's daunting strength, a challenge even with full bellies, let alone our weakened state. Surveying each other, a grim understanding settled among us as we eyed the dead pig-faced bats littering the ground. In our desperate situation, survival instincts prevailed over squeamishness. Humanity, after all, is omnivorous by nature. Ingzi reminisced about eating bats with her grandfather during a mountain fire and famine when all larger animals had disappeared. According to her, bat tendons and crispy bones are a delicacy with plenty of texture to chew on. These fearsome-looking pig-faced bats lying around did not inspire culinary confidence, their withered bodies resembling desiccated corpses of bloodthirsty demons. Reluctantly, we reasoned that to make a fire for cooking, we would have to return to the armory, a place abundant with wooden boxes and other material that could serve as fuel, despite the somber alternative of using coffin wood, which tainted our appetites with taboo. Fatty, with the practicality of survival in mind, looped together the paws of several large dead bats with a piece of rope, including the largest, the Bat King. Once back in the armory, we set the coats containing the children's bodies aside as Ingzi took out a knife and began to butcher the bats, beheading the grotesque creatures, removing their innards, and peeling off their skin as best as she could. Gathering a pile of wooden crates, I kicked them apart into planks, shaved some wood shavings, and lit them up with a match, with Fatty assisting to fan the blaze. We then skewered the bats on bayonets and started roasting them over the fire. Fatty grimaced at the prospect of eating such fare. Ingzi urged, "It's not bad. Don't think of them as bats. Chew a bit more, and it'll taste just like lamb." I was more indifferent. Bats are not much different from rodents. After all, during exercises in Shaanxi, I had tried all kinds of field rats, from dormice to flying squirrels. Their taste was similar, with fat and lean layers that indeed resembled mutton, though bat meat was still uncharted territory for me. As warm-blooded creatures without much fat, pig-faced bats shouldn't be overcooked. Trying a piece once it seemed ready, I found the shoulder meat crispy, laden with tendons and cartilage, not as tasty as lamb, but definitely chewy. Encouraged by my example, Fatty pinched his nose and took a hesitant bite, only to find it satisfactory. He devoured one swiftly and proceeded to roast the Bat King eagerly. As we feasted on nearly half our unusual banquet, a sticky, glistening liquid suddenly dripped from the ceiling directly above Fatty, landing squarely on his face. Busy eating, Fatty casually wiped the wetness from his cheek and complained with surprise, "Who's drooling so much up there that it's dripping on me?" As the words left his mouth, he realized the oddity of his question. The three of us were the fortress's sole inhabitants, and neither Ingzi nor I had the angle to dribble saliva onto him from across the fire. Perplexed, we all craned our necks upward, searching for the source of this mysterious ooze. The makeshift fire illuminated our surroundings, but shadows loomed beyond its reach, heavy with unseen threats. Where light met darkness overhead dangled a gargantuan human-like face. It seemed somehow pale and powdered, wholly devoid of expression, and its substantial size dwarfed any normal human's countenance. The hooked nose, the unervingly red eyes fixated on Fatty's treat, thick lips bulging forward, opening to reveal a gaping black maw and a red tongue, dripping with anticipation. This peculiar creature, with its lengthy neck and toughened skin, was hidden within the dark extremities of the armory's high ceiling, making only its face and a stretch of neck visible to us. It watched our bat feast with a carnivorous interest, poised on the edge of the darkness, hesitant to swoop down for fear of the flickering flames below. Yet the lure of the heated delicacy was too strong for the mysterious beholder. It seemed on the verge of defying its trepidation and crashing our little roasting party. Was this ghoulish visage human or beast? As we caught sight of it, our responses ranged from shock to morbid curiosity. Though I couldn't place the origin of this eerie figure, its yearning for our roasted bat was unmistakable. We had extracted a total of 5 hefty pig-faced bats from the caverns, of which Ingzi and I had consumed half each while Fatty had demolished one whole. Of the remaining 3, one was the aforementioned Bat King, split into thirds, with a slice sizzling on the bayonet over the flames. Even in pieces, the size and heft of these bat portions were intimidating. They rivaled the bulk of a young child. We regulated the cooking, aware that bats shouldn't linger too long over the fire. In our urgency, decorum took a back seat. Witnessing Fatty petrified by the enormous face above, I acted swiftly, seizing the bayonet from his frozen grip. I brandished it before the looming apparition, intending a defiant toss into the darkness. However, my forceful action only resulted in the dislodgement of the bat meat, which landed not far behind Ingzi, and before she could react, a colossal creature leaped from the heights, snatching the coveted Bat King in a heartbeat and consuming it with voracious haste. Illuminated by the flicker of our fire, we got a clear view of the creature that was undoubtedly not human. Its face resembled a baboon, almost human-like, set atop a remarkably long neck. Its body was bear-like in size and shape, but without the bear's clumsiness. Comparatively, it seemed slightly flattened, with bowed, short and stout hind limbs and exceptionally long forelimbs, allowing it to skillfully grasp onto crevices in the walls and hang above us. Watching it move, it was apparently more at home crawling on walls than walking on flat ground. Neither Ingzi nor I had ever seen such a creature, but Fatty and I recalled its image from a museum visit. As it revealed itself in full view, it clicked in our minds: the prairie sloth, no doubt. This animal inhabited the deep underground caverns of the grasslands in regions like South America, Africa, and Outer Mongolia, distinct from its jungle-dwelling cousins and even more so from its distant relative, the tree sloth. The prairie sloth inherited traits from its ancestor, the megatherium, being particularly large and mostly carnivorous, with infrequent activity under sunlight, and a penchant for preying on large bats, ground rodents, and pythons dwelling underground. The hunting strategy of the prairie sloth was one of stillness. It hardly made proactive strikes, opting instead to remain concealed in darkness, still as a statue, sometimes for days on end without food or drink. Only when an animal came close would it then lurch forward with its gaping maw, swallowing its prey in a swift gulp. Soon after our nation was founded, an African country gifted a prairie sloth to the Beijing Zoo, but it couldn't adapt to the new environment and soon died. Fatty, some classmates, and I, during a trip to Beijing, along with a group of Red Guards, had aimlessly roamed around, stumbling upon the massive empty cage in the zoo that once housed the gifted prairie sloth. The impression of the empty cage, complete with its introduction and images, stayed with us. Yet never had we imagined encountering such a giant specimen within the confines of the Guangdong Army's underground fortress. It was likely following the trail of the pig-faced bats to this place. Within the fortress, countless bats could be found. We observed thousands in just one cavern. As vast as the fortress stretched over kilometers, who knows how many more nests might be hidden in its depths. The prairie sloth was truly formidable, armored with thick skin and small ossified plates beneath its hide, as if it were garbed in an array of unbreakable armor. The dreaded pig-faced bats, with their sharp claws capable of easily tearing into the stomachs of cattle and sheep, were no match for it. The slightest scratch was nothing but a tickle to the sloth, and here, devoid of any natural predators and with an ample supply of pig-faced bats for the taking, it thrived like a king of the underground realm, striking prey at will with nothing to stop its might. It was a mystery how such a large sloth managed to enter the fortress. Perhaps an earthquake or a landslide caused significant cracks in the fortress's structure, which then became passages for this giant to find sustenance within. If we could find that same entrance, it might also serve as our pathway out. Upon landing from the ceiling and devouring the roasted bat, the prairie sloth extended its long tongue, clearly unsated by the small offering and evidently hungering for more, with its gaze settling curiously upon us next. In this underground world, this creature reigned supreme, and it occasionally hunted actively. When it moved, it was unstoppable. As we faced off, thoughts raced through my mind. The layout of the underground fortress and how to handle a wild beast were somewhat unfamiliar territories for me. Should we take preemptive action? The Type 100 submachine gun at hand had limited killing power, not quite enough to penetrate the prairie sloth's sturdy bone armor. Provoking it without a clear escape plan could spell disaster. The Arisaka rifle carried by the Japanese army, however, packed enough punch to potentially take down the sloth. But the rifles, loaded and ready, were at least 20 or 30 meters away. One of us would need to distract the sloth for the other to retrieve the weapons. Such a maneuver would take precious time, and the sloth was dangerously close. Mulling over the options, I felt unsure until Fatty, standing his ground, whispered to me, "Old Who, remember, These beasts prefer warm-blooded and cold-blooded animals. They don't eat humans. I think we'll be fine." To emphasize his point, he nudged a dead bat toward the prairie sloth, as if saying, "Here, all yours. Now leave us in peace." But the prairie sloth ignored the offered bat, salivating even more copiously as it focused its attention on us instead. Fatty turned to me with a nervous query. "Why isn't it eating the bats? It keeps staring at us like it's got some nasty plans." I couldn't afford to be distracted by conversation. My focus was on the prairie sloth's every move, ready to act first if it showed any signs of attack. My plan was to grab the submachine gun lying nearby and unleash a volley of shots. Ingzi, voicing a half-formed thought, said, "We've eaten quite a bit of the roasted bat meat. Maybe it thinks we are." She didn't finish her sentence before the prairie sloth, unable to resist the tantalizing scent of cooked meat, started inching toward us. Carnivorous by nature and having never experienced cooked flesh, the novel flavor of roasted meat presented an irresistible temptation to the creature. Noting its sluggish movements, I figured fighting might not be necessary. Running was the better option. I signaled the others, and we turned to flee. Hardly 2 steps into our escape, I tripped over something solid, crashing to the ground with such force that it nearly shattered my knee, with Fatty and Ingzi tumbling down as well. Puzzled by what could have tripped me on such even ground, I glanced back and saw nothing obstructive. A thought crossed my mind. As I was so focused on escaping, had I forgotten to bring along the bodies of the sacrificial children? Was it a ghostly trip-up? The prairie sloth probably had never seen a bipedal creature like humans before. Smelling the scent of roasted bat on us, it seemed to mistake us for oversized bats, yet its instincts were conflicted, both enticed by the aroma and wary of the firelight, deliberating how to devour us. When it saw us fall, it pounced immediately, drawn by the prospect of an easy meal. Its muscular hind limbs were powerful, propelling it straight to Fatty with a single leap. Fatty, thinking fast amidst the chaos, desperately searched the ground for a weapon. Fortuitously, he found one of the bayonets used to grill the bats. Seizing it, he stabbed the creature's arm, burying the blade to its hilt. The heated bayonet, long exposed to the flames, glowed like a red-hot iron rod. Striking the sloth, a smell of burning flesh filled the air. Such a creature, a predator unchallenged in the underground caverns, had never faced such fiery pain before. Though hurt and angered, it hesitated to attack again and withdrew a few steps, looking for another opportunity to strike. The glowing blade quickly cooled after the stab, the blood of the sloth steaming off the metal. Fatty's successful hit depended on the high temperature of the bayonet. Otherwise, it would hardly pierce the animal's hide. Seizing the moment as Fatty repelled the assailant, Ingzi and I slung the army coats containing the Ming Chi of the sacrificial children onto our backs, hoping the 2 little ghosts wouldn't cause more mischief. As I grabbed the submachine gun, aware that its firepower was insufficient against the prairie sloth, I still hoped for the best in a critical moment. Before I could even cock the gun, a claw shot out from the wall behind me, aiming for my head. The claw was swift and forceful. I didn't have time to duck, so I used the submachine gun as a shield. The claw's sweep was too strong. I lost my grip, and the gun flew from my hands, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Unbeknown to us, 4 more prairie sloths had descended from the walls, attracted by the same scent that lured the first. The smallest of the new quartet was almost the size of an adult, and like the first, they had been drawn in by the smell of the roasted bats. 5 prairie sloths encircled us tightly, ready to pounce at any given signal, turning us into shreds for their feasting pleasure. Our only lifeline was the dwindling fire before us. Standing back to back, Fatty armed with a bayonet, Ingzi with the submachine gun, and I with bare hands, we prepared for the worst, the dimming light signaling our coming vulnerability. I muttered grimly, "One was trouble enough. Now we've got the whole damn sloth family from the fortress on our hands, trapped with no way out. How are we to carve a path through?" Persistence was not on our side. In desperation, I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and swung it towards the smallest prairie sloth blocking our escape. It recoiled in surprise, the the circle breaking momentarily. The flames on the torch were faint, and the swing nearly snuffed them out. Wasting no time, we rushed through the gap. The saliva-dripping sloths hesitated, but then leaped at us simultaneously. Ingzi's submachine gun chattered, hitting the lead sloth, splattering blood, yet barely penetrating their thick hide and bone armor, enraging them more with every shot. They pressed on, determined to taste us. Ingzi was the only one with a gun. Every time she stopped to reload, Fatty and I brandished our fiery sticks to fend off our encroaching demise. We fought and retreated blindly, somehow ending up at the great iron door of the armory, dangerously far from our abandoned weapons. Just beyond the iron door was the evil spirit body, the zombie. After satisfying our hunger, we had hoped to gather our wits and find a way out through the passage beyond that door. Yet, the sudden onslaught by the prairie sloths threw us into disarray, and we hastily retreated to this spot. Our torches dwindled, leaving only blackened, embered sticks. Ammunition was scarce. The prairie sloths loomed large, pressing against each other like an impenetrable wall. A swipe of their paws was enough to break bones. The circle they formed drew tighter. We had our backs against the door, with nowhere to go. In desperation, Fatty and I threw our smoking sticks at the sloths, while Ingzi loosed a burst from her Type 100 submachine gun, forcing them to stagger back. Seizing the moment, Fatty swung the previously sealed door wide open, and I chucked a black donkey hoof toward the outside. Contrary to our expectation, the zombie was not waiting, giving us a mere sliver of a chance to slip into the passage within. As Fatty moved to seal the door again, it was met with tremendous force from the other side. The prairie sloths were immensely powerful, and despite our collective effort, we struggled to close the door. Then, a cold gust hit us, and I dodged reflexively. The source was the ancient general of the Jin dynasty, whose corpse was animated by a malevolent spirit and had never strayed far from the door. Lifeless in intellect, a zombie enchanted by a sorcerer's curse, it lunged mindlessly at signs of life. The zombie attacked silently, but I managed to roll away and evade. Just then, the door gave way, and the largest of the prairie sloths vaulted out. Its powerful hind legs propelled it forward like a giant frog, and it collided with the zombie, who, rigid in death, bounced up and retaliated. Its claws, sharp as blades, piercing the attacker's chest. With a howl, the prairie sloth snapped its jaw, and the other sloths also emerged from the armory. Witnessing their kin wounded, they all began to tear into the zombie. One of the smallest prairie sloths had its head gruesomely torn off by the zombie, while two other sloths clenched onto it. Their strength seemed evenly matched, and in a bizarre twist of fate, they became entangled in a fierce struggle. In moments, the walls, floor, and iron door were splattered with copious amounts of prairie sloth blood, with chunks of flesh flying all around, and also, one of the zombie's arms was savagely bitten off. Witnessing this ghastly scene, we were secretly horrified, realizing that had the zombie and the prairie sloths decided to coordinate and attack us from both sides, our end would have been certain. Ironically, our blunder had incited a battle between two fierce creatures, a stroke of sheer luck for us. We seized the moment of chaos to escape, carrying the Ming Chi of the sacrificial children, and dashed toward the breach in the tomb's rear wall. Our escape was desperate, akin to a dog running for its life or a fish slipping through the net. A humiliation too profound for words. The broken wall still gaped as we had left it, having circled back to it after escaping earlier, a redundant and treacherous roundabout that brought us no treasures, only troubles and the added burden of the mercury-filled children's corpses. However, the underground fortress might not hold wealth but was stocked with equipment and clothing, and perhaps some simple generators would still be found. A small consolation we could share with our village, given the time we'd risked our lives here. All that remained was to climb out through the vertical shaft of the thieves' tunnel. By then, our physical and mental strengths were nearly depleted, but desperation spurs untapped potential. Ingzi fired the submachine gun at the coffin boards sealing the thieves' tunnel, turning the wood to splinters with 2 full magazines. The coffin lids, which were embedded into the wall, broke apart under her barrage. Fatty, energized by adrenaline, charged and shattered the wooden barrier with his shoulder, reopening the tunnel. I boosted Ingzi into the shaft first, then with Fatty's help, placed the bodies of the sacrificial children above. Ingzi grabbed them from the top, then reached down to pull me up. Fatty was the last one left behind, because he needed to be pulled up the vertical shaft before he could climb. Just as he was about to ascend, two blood-soaked prairie sloths burst into the tomb chamber, crazed and bellowing thunderously, likely because the zombie had slain the rest of their family. Even as fearsome as the zombie was, it could hardly withstand such massive beasts and had been reduced to pieces. The two remaining wounded prairie sloths, their eyes blood-red with rage, were relentless in pursuit and followed us into the tomb chamber. Fatty, glancing back and seeing them close in, scrambled up the shaft in a panic, but the more frantically he climbed, the more he struggled. The prairie sloths reached the mouth of the thieves' tunnel, but fortunately for us, the hole was too small for them. They furiously clawed at the earth, trying to widen the tunnel to give chase. Seeing the urgency, I grabbed Ingzi's submachine gun and passed it to Fatty, who understood immediately. He fired a few rounds to repel the prairie sloths at the tunnel entrance, then aimed a sweeping barrage at the tomb chamber's precious dragon-fired glass ceiling. Glass shattered, and bags of Western region dragon oil cascaded down, engulfing the entire tomb and the two prairie sloths in flames. Meanwhile, Ingzi and I exerted our last strength to pull Fatty from the shaft. But even so, his trousers caught fire from the blaze in the tunnel, singing him badly enough to reveal his backside. As he pat out the flames, he yelped in pain like a scalded pig, and Ingzi quickly doused the fire on his behind with her water bottle. Our loyal hunting dog sat faithfully by, watching the three of us emerge from the hole. The bright noonday sun was a stark contrast to the gloomy depths we had escaped. I rubbed my eyes, feeling like we'd just traveled through time. Clutching his rear with one hand and holding up two jade-by discs with the other, Fatty couldn't resist breaking into verse, reciting lines from a famous poem about the Great War. The flames of war have been extinguished, the gun smoke has cleared. Oh sun, never have you been so warm. Oh sky, never have you been so blue. Oh, the smile on the children's faces, never have they been so sweet. Ingzi and I couldn't help but burst into laughter as we watched Fatty's antics. Have you ever seen a poet reciting while clutching their buttocks? However, our laughter quickly froze as something unexpected happened.